Hi everyone, and welcome, and thank everyone for joining us today. We're up to almost 80 people on our call today, and we did have over 100 people registered, so there may be a few more people join us shortly. My name is Rachel O'Neill. I'm the Government Education and Community Banking Executive for New South Wales and Queensland at NAB, and I'm excited to be your host for today's session. Our Education Insight session for the year. We do like to hold these semi-regularly, but obviously with the way we've all been working in the last 18 months, almost 2 years, it's been a little bit more difficult. And I was just commenting before how professional we're getting with our Zooms and everything else now, with a great NAB team helping us get this together today. So firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. Pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people joining us today. So today we're here to share with you the key findings from a research initiative undertaken by PeopleBench, a school workforce research and analytics company, and we'll also share NAB's perspective on talent attraction and engagement and the future of work. After the disruption and changes we've experienced in the last 18 months, we really feel this information is even more relevant than ever before, and I do hope you will enjoy the session. We'll have some time for questions and answers at the end, and if you could enter any questions you may have via the Q&A button on your screen, that would be great, and feel free to just be entering those as the session goes on, and we'll get to them at the end. So we will move straight into all exciting content. So I'm excited today to be joined by our guest speakers from PeopleBench. We're joined by founder and CEO Fleur Johnson. Fleur founded PeopleBench with the aim of empowering school leaders to build great school workforces to achieve the best possible outcomes for students. Fleur is joined by Chief Research and Insights Officer Mike Hennessy from PeopleBench. Mike combines his practical consulting skill set with a restless curiosity and a passion for designing research which creates real-world social impact. And last but certainly not least, Moira McGarva joins us as the partnerships lead at PeopleBench, who brings her strategic focus and creativity to help schools and their leaders achieve the vision for their school workforce. So on that note, over to the PeopleBench team. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. We're really excited to be with you all today. And look, I'm largely just going to sort of top and tail the discussion as Rachel's introduced you to the team. We're really going to hand a lot of the initial information and sharing time to Mike, Chief Research and Insights Officer. I guess just very briefly a little bit of context about us. So you've heard a bit of a spiel. I think it's fair to say that across the whole team that have come together, and when I speak about our PeopleBench team, I really do include our clients. The problems that we're solving at PeopleBench are problems that we saw some years ago in consulting, and we couldn't really solve them without the research and the benchmarks that we're now co-developing and co-designing with our clients across the sector. So Mike and I and Moira all have backgrounds in workplace psychology and career histories that have spanned, consulting from internal roles as well as external. I guess, simply put, we conceive of ourselves as a workforce improvement company, but we're a bit different to the other players in this space. We're not like a HRIS company. We're not like a BI company. We're really putting ourselves in the space of working with schools and systems to build better workforces through workforce strategy. And of course, to do really good workforce strategy, we have to have that research and a suite of tools and resources to help build capability across the sector in what workforce strategy is about. And that lends itself then to the pieces that we do in the advisory space. So to anchor you in our minds, they're the areas that we're focused on. And really it's around a number of problem spaces. So the types of projects we tend to get involved in are around those big picture questions. How do I form an evidence-based workforce strategy that uses the fabulous intuition and wisdom of our school leaders, but actually gets much more into the space of systems and processes we see in other community impact sectors. This big topic that we'll hear more from NAB and your insights team today too, future of work. What does that actually mean for education service delivery models? How will schooling look different in the future, and therefore what should its workforce be shaped like? And then maturing the HR function in our schools and our systems of schools. As this dialogue becomes more sophisticated, of course, we need greater capability and capacity in our business management and HR functions. So helping schools actually analyse where they're at on that journey and helping them get next level is further work that we do. Rural and regional, some of these issues, of course, bite faster and harder in those areas where supply is even more constricted. So we particularly have a niche interest in rural and regional schools. And one of the fundamental underpinnings in having a high-performance school workforce is ensuring it continues to be able to perform even though the change and challenge is constant. So tracking and building workforce resilience is another space that we're spending a lot of time hanging out. So that's really a preface then to today's session. Our State of the Sector report was recently released. We assume some of you will have blink tested and others will perhaps not have seen it at all. So Mike, on that next slide, I think we've got a summary of the points we'd like to cover. And they are the main points from the report. So I might hand to you at this point and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Fleur. Yeah, so this is intended to be a brief briefing. I'm going to share the key themes from the State of the Sector survey. There is a lot more detail in the online digital version of the report. So for those of you who are so inclined and haven't had a chance to have a read yet, we encourage you to have a look because that's where we break down the findings by sector, by school type, etc. So you'll be able to find something that's a little bit more directly relevant to your own context. But what I want to talk about today is the overarching themes, what they mean in today's context, how they compare to what we found the last time we did this survey in 2019, and how we think this is going to look in the future. And we'll conclude with a bit of a discussion about how we think leaders can respond to these findings and these emerging trends. So this is a survey that we ran in March this year, and our sample looked like this. We had almost 500 responses across these different role types, which is really encouraging. Previously, we ran this survey in 2019 and had 155 principals respond. We focused on principals exclusively in 2019, but this time around, we broadened that focus out so that we could capture some of the different perspectives on the future of the school workforce and the challenges that schools experience in the workforce day to day, week to week, term to term. And that's how we wound up with this sample of principals, other school leaders, middle leaders, teachers, and also business and HR advisors in schools. This map just shows you the geographic spread of respondents. And, the really encouraging thing from our perspective about this particular illustration is we're seeing these red dots move away from the coast and into the regions. So we've obviously got good coverage in the major metro centres. But what's really important for us is to make sure that we capture the breadth of the geographic and local context that schools exist within when we're thinking about the workforce challenges that they're facing. So really encouraging to see that reflected in our sample. The first section of this report delves into what we're calling sentiment in the sector. This is really trying to get a bit of a pulse check of how people are feeling in the school when they think about the school workforce. Overwhelmingly, what we found in this part of the survey was that teachers are understandably doing it pretty tough. There's a million ways that you can slice this. We know that teaching roles are not easy. They never have been. They are becoming more challenging. They are becoming more broad, and they are becoming more prone to a lot of emotional labour and really significant challenges on a day-to-day basis. The silver lining to this section of the report is that leaders are pretty well placed to lead their school workforces through challenging times like we're seeing at the moment. So I'll talk a little bit about what that means. One of the things we asked respondents to do in this section was share one word to describe how they feel about the school workforce today. So you can imagine with 500 respondents, we got almost as many words. But when we stitched together the themes that united a lot of those responses, what we found was pretty consistent themes around overwhelm, busyness, and exhaustion. So not a really heartening finding to begin with. but it's probably one that didn't surprise us and probably won't surprise most of you on the call today, given that you've been living this pandemic for 18 months and notwithstanding all the challenges that came pre-pandemic in day-to-day life in schools. We broke that down into positive, neutral, and negative sentiment. So for each word, we basically assigned it one of those categories. And this is where we start to see the silver lining peeking through. So when we look at that breakdown by category and role type in our sample, we see this pattern of positivity increasing. So the blue bars here represent the proportion of responses that were positive in tone. That positivity increases as you move up the hierarchy in schools. So from teacher to middle leader to senior leader to principal, as you progress, you're more likely to choose a positive word. That is really important because, as I alluded to earlier, principals are going to be the ones that set the tone culturally for the school workforce, and they'll be the ones that need to make the decisions that will support these folks who are doing it tougher to manage the impact of these challenging situations on themselves. So that in itself is something that's worth holding on to as a sign for hope for the future. We looked at this in a few different ways, but one of the ways that I think is telling is asking people to think about the degree to which they feel excited when they think about the school workforce, the degree to which they feel confident that the school workforce can execute its vision, the degree to which they feel well prepared to deal with the challenges that they will see over time. When we break this down by role type, again, what we see is principals out there on their own. So this is the percentage of respondents who chose an optimistic response to these questions. So that is another good sign. And perhaps even more heartening from our perspective is the fact that when we compare this finding to what we found in 2019, it's pretty consistent. So in spite of everything that's happened in the intervening 2 years and all of the challenges that COVID has wrought across the sector, principals remain about as optimistic as they were when we did this research last. So again, really positive when we think about the tone that they'll set for the rest of the school workforce. Unfortunately, we see teachers much further down the pack, much less likely to feel excited, feel confident, feel well prepared. So there's work to be done to support those folks. We ask people to cast their mind forward 3 years and think about the same questions. And again, what we find is principals leading the way in terms of the optimism in their responses. And again, that's a trend that we saw in 2019. It's remained fairly constant. And again, teachers further down. So we have teachers and middle leaders showing that they need perhaps more support or different support to what they're currently accessing in a lot of parts of the sector. So that's the sentiment piece. I guess underneath all of this, what is most concerning from our perspective is that we might be seeing signs here that are representative of burnout in the workplace. This is not a psychometric assessment. It's not a clinical health assessment in any way, shape or form. But when you think about the sentiment that people expressed in these questions, they really start to look like some of those chronic burnout challenges. So the onus is really on leaders in the sector and policymakers to act fairly quickly to respond to these things, because the longer they go on, the more difficult it will be to bring them back under control. We'll talk a little bit at the end of this session about some of the things that leaders might consider in responding to that particular finding in the report. The next section is about workforce priorities. So thinking about the strategic priorities that school leaders have available to them, which are the most important. And what we're seeing here is that workforce strategy is starting to emerge as one of the most important levers that school leaders can pull to drive school improvement. So we know that leaders have obviously finite time, finite resources available to them. So where they choose to place their effort and their resources and their emphasis is really telling and will shape the future of the school workforce. One of the ways we looked at this was by asking people to basically rank a menu of different priorities or different strategies that they could choose to implement at their school. I guess unsurprisingly, teaching and learning strategy was the most important one for a majority of respondents. That's core business, totally understandable. But we see in a lot of contexts, workforce strategy emerging as the second most important. So this is consistent with what we know about the resources that are invested into the school workforce. So 3/4 to 80% of recurrent expenditure in schools is spent on the workforce in the OECD countries. But this is perhaps not a discussion that we would have seen coming to the fore 5, 10 years ago. So this is really encouraging from our perspective, because there is a lot of opportunity to be had here in taking a more evidence-based, planful approach to how you want to meet the future of your school's workforce. What we have at the moment is, from our perspective, probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Prior to COVID, the sector had largely made incremental progress on addressing some of the chronic, long-standing workforce challenges that we've seen in K-12 education, and that progress has often been localised. Everybody went through COVID disruption in March 2020, regardless of where you were in the country or what type of school you were. That disruption in itself provides us an opportunity to take stock and think about whether we want to do things the way that we've done them previously, or whether we might want to start being a bit more bold and doing things a little bit more radically different to try and address that paradigm that we've seen in the history of school workforces. So we know that once things return to something that looks more like normal in the eastern seaboard states, as lockdowns ease, the temptation will always be to snap back to normal, the way that we've historically done things. Our urge to the sector is to resist that and look at ways that we can plan more deliberately for the future. So thinking about some of those challenges that school workforces see, what we find here over this period between 2019 and now is the increasing importance of supply and recruitment issues in schools. So there's always been a really prominent public discussion about workforce supply, how difficult it is to attract to schools. But what we see in this survey is that seems to have ramped up over the past 18 months. This chart shows you a list of workforce challenges and where they were positioned in the 2019 survey, where they were positioned in this survey as at March, and where people expected them to be in 3 years' time. It's a little bit counterintuitive in that if you see a line moving down and to the right, it means that issue has increased in importance. So if you take attraction and recruitment of new staff as an example, that has increased in importance from 7th place in 2019 right up to 3rd place in 2021. So that is a significant jump. In spite of that, we see the top 5 more or less remaining consistent, but the order has shuffled. Though we have seen some factors cool off, if you like. So improving staff resilience, establishing a pipeline of future leaders, and training staff have come off the boil a little bit compared to where they were in 2019. And they've been replaced largely by these supply-related factors. So shoring up a supply, attracting folks to the school and keeping them there so that you mitigate turnover. Clearly very front of mind for a lot of people. How does that look in terms of particular types of roles? We asked respondents to identify the single type of teaching role that posed the greatest supply challenge for their school. And what we saw was in secondary schools, maths teachers quite prominently featured there, but also this bucket of other teachers, which largely contained special ed and design and tech teachers. They were the most pressing workforce challenges among teaching roles in those secondary schools. In primary schools, it's that middle year section, so teachers from years 3 to 6. And in combined years schools, so K to 12, for example, it's the commonly discussed issues around maths and STEM, as well as senior secondary, that were really front of mind. On the non-teaching workforce side of things, we see teaching support roles pretty consistently listed as the greatest challenge. This is important from our perspective because if we're going to address some of these challenges around potential burnout and the overwhelm that sits underneath that, we're going to have to design teaching roles differently. So we can't continue with teaching roles the way that they've been operating historically. If we're going to design teaching roles differently, then we have to design teaching support roles differently so that we can carve up what teachers are responsible for and allocate appropriate segments of that to other folks in the school. So teaching support roles in and of themselves are really important to watch over the next 5 years. Thinking about HR in schools, we know that HR is on a maturation journey. It's a relatively recent phenomenon as a function in schools compared to a lot of other industries. And the results of this survey kind of speak to that. What we find when we ask people about the type of HR support that's provided in their school is that it tends to skew more towards those operational ends. So recruitment, employee and industrial relations, and workplace health and safety, all of which are obviously vitally important every day. But we see less of the strategic end of the spectrum. So workforce strategy and planning was among the least cited functions performed at school. Again, not surprising given the journey that HR has been on in schools, but it is an area where we'd like to see growth in the future. The relative strengths of the HR function really seem to lie in this training and developing staff piece and the diversity and inclusion piece in the school workforce, which is obviously fantastic. The flip side of that is that there's work to be done on supporting flexible work, remaining engaged with staff alumni, and proactively empowering staff to boost their resilience and manage the challenges that they see day to day. Thinking about COVID, COVID has really reshuffled a lot of people's priorities, particularly in terms of how they invest in their own development. But it's also given us an opportunity to see the best in school communities, which is fantastic. So I'm going to skip through this, but I guess unsurprisingly, we've seen that people reported technological skills as increasing in importance in their school. But what we see on the inverse of that is that relatively few people say that they need to decrease any of these areas in terms of relative importance. So people are just adding new things to their professional development list at the school and not necessarily taking other things away. When we think about how this looks in terms of the way people think differently as a result of COVID, collaboration, connection to community are really consistent themes here, which is very, very encouraging from our perspective. So people have really seen this as an opportunity to deepen those networks in their school. What we see alongside that is an increasing importance on resilience and well-being, and the agility part of that in particular. So people have really acknowledged that agility and being able to adapt quickly, understandably, to changing circumstances has been a really great strength to come from COVID and how they've responded. And as we look to the future, what we find in terms of people's concerns about what might negatively affect the workforce and what might positively support the workforce is that there are strengths to be built upon when it comes to culture, capability, and well-being. So leaders have some really great opportunities there, but that issue around workload and job design really needs to be addressed sooner rather than later if we're to really make progress towards the workforce that we want for the future. So with that, I will hand over to Fleur.
Thanks, Mike. I'm conscious that we're going to go into a Q&A session. So really in forming up some key points out of the report, and maybe as a segue into that discussion, there really were half a dozen points that came out of the report, which we're seeing sector leaders really engage heavily in these dialogues, and which I guess when we're working with particularly individual schools, we're keen for them to make sure that these are part of their board and exec leadership conversations. You've heard Mike touch a number of times through the report on workforce resilience and wellbeing. So really taking a science and data informed approach so that you can take sustainable action in that space is going to continue to be important. And then the second point really flows on from that. If we're to do that in an evidence informed way, then obviously the research, the data, and being able to measure impact. So what does it mean for the workforce? But most importantly in the school, what does this stuff mean for impact for learning, impact for communities? And making sure that we don't leave those data sets disparate is going to be incredibly important in making progress in this space. Underpinning that, redesigning our service delivery model. So how, if we're going to deliver schooling differently, building the capability and capacity in schools to be able to do those service innovation projects, which really have never been required in any substantial, repeatable way in schools until now. This starts to introduce a whole nother skill set that we'll be needing to build for the future. Workforce strategy, obviously we're going to talk to you about workforce strategy, but if we're going to do this, we need to start to shift our thinking beyond what does the workforce look like next year, how do I get another maths teacher to fill that role, into medium and long-term thinking to shift the needle in some of these areas that we know that schools are starting to feel the pain. And schools have been great at being really pushed deeply into the space of business continuity and scenario planning throughout COVID. Certainly the clients that we're working with are starting to put quite drastic resource scenarios in place just to test their thinking and to push them into that space of how do we deliver schooling quite differently, given the trends that we're seeing in workforce data. And then, of course, to do these things successfully, we're going to have to start to focus more in on some of the skill sets around program, project and change management than schools perhaps have needed to in the past. So they really are the half a dozen key points out of the research report. And I think we're handing back to some discussion, Moira, with you.
Yes. So thanks, Fleur, and certainly so much to digest there. So if you'd like to join the conversation, pop onto LinkedIn and you can find us, PeopleBench, and would be great to follow us, and that way you can start to get access to some great research, some tools and materials there as well. And please feel free to connect with us directly through LinkedIn. For those of you who are interested in learning more, there'll be some information shared. NAB is kindly sharing our contact details so that you can order a kit. And that has some really good information, including workforce strategy sample or exemplar, and some really pertinent information as well in terms of school improvement. So I'd now like to introduce our Future of Work video. Thanks, everyone.
As we look at the world of work, we see a future characterised by globalisation, extreme flexibility, interconnectedness, continuous learning, automation, technology enhancements, and work demanding a level of resilience and multidisciplinarity like never before. The aftermath of the pandemic should prompt a critical rethinking of what matters in teaching. As we look at the world of education, we see that where, how, and when our students learn and our staff work is rich with opportunities to change and evolve. What does the future of education look like? How can we reimagine schooling delivery? How do we make schools great places to learn and great places to work? Humans will continue to play the most important part in developing the next generations of our society and economy. The future of education is calling us to transform the way we think about teaching and teachers, how and what students need to learn, teacher and student mental health and well-being, social inequity, school leadership, technology and its role in learning, teaching and managing schools. The future of education is challenging us to rethink our assumptions about the best ways to attract and retain teachers, schooling delivery, flexible work practices in education, and the role of technology. We owe it to the students of today and tomorrow to plan for a new normal, to plan for multiple scenarios, to plan for uncertainty, to give them the best possible future. We owe it to the teachers of today and tomorrow to empower them by creating the best possible places to work, using the best evidence, the best tools, and the best practices available. The future of education is now.
Good. Thank you, Fleur, Mike and Moira, for that very insightful presentation and information. Certainly always great when there's comparative data across different years, I think, and even more so now as we're sort of in this pre and hopefully post-COVID world and what that means. And the snapback is certainly a word I'm hearing more and more, I think, around what for a lot of industries, what is the new normal for us. So, and on that note too, I think some of the things you spoke about, there's certainly some similarities across various sectors to what you're talking to there too. And I'd like to introduce as our next speaker, Carly Lloyd, who is NAB's Director of Future of Work. And Carly's responsible for developing NAB's ways of working and future talent strategies. And I'm sure it will be very complementary, whilst a different sector, to what you have all just spoken about too. So thank you, and over to you, Carly.
Thanks, and thanks everyone. Pleasure to be joining you today from my spare bedroom here in Sydney. I'm just going to pull up on screen a couple of slides that I'm going to share with you briefly, but can definitely echo the sentiments we just heard there from the team at PeopleBench in terms of absolutely similar themes around busyness, exhaustion, burnout, the need for flexibility, well-being, and so on. So those are themes that we're seeing across industry, across sector, and things that we're absolutely grappling with at NAB as well. So as I mentioned, as I was introduced, I should say, my work focuses on the future of work for NAB, and I'm part of the HR function, or what we call the people and culture function at NAB. And I guess I've got a quote to start us off with on the first slide here, which I think, really sums up for me sort of this unique period of time that we're in right now in the world. And what we're going through really is that once in a generation opportunity where just about everything is up for grabs right now. And it's really about how much of this opportunity we take to use to do things differently versus actually going back to how things were previously. And certainly all the research we're seeing globally is that people don't want to go back to the way things were before. They've seen that there are new and different ways that we can do things. And so let's use this as an opportunity and not waste a good crisis, I guess. But the other thing is the future of work is a journey that lots of industries and organisations have been on for some time, and COVID has really just accelerated that for us. So it's not necessarily something that we weren't thinking about beforehand, but certain aspects of the way we work have definitely accelerated as a result of that. So in the brief time I've got with you today, I just thought I'd focus around two key questions, and I'll try to, I guess, draw as much as I can parallels, but, and try to only talk to, I guess, content that's relevant for the school sector. So no surprises, one of the key things we're focusing on at NAB and was also echoed in the PeopleBench research as a key focus area for you is how do we attract and retain and engage employees now and over the next couple of years. And the second thing is, as relevant for you, what should schools be thinking about when you're preparing students for this future workforce that they will be entering? Because it will be a different workforce than the one we've all grown up in and the one that we probably used to prepare them for. So I thought it's worth sharing a couple of things as to how I think that might affect the world that they'll be heading into. So on that first question, how can employers, including schools, attract, retain and engage employees? And these are very much a couple of things that we are very much focused on here at NAB and that we are seeing throughout the market, both here in Australia and also globally. Talent attraction and retention is absolutely number one issue affecting most organisations right now. And that's, I guess, a number of reasons why that's showing up as strongly as it is. One is our closed borders, and that's quite unique to Australia, unlike the rest of the world that still had people moving around. We've lost a lot of that immigration that we normally rely on here, and a lot of people that were in the country have gone back home now. We've also seen that through the pandemic, people have been less likely to change jobs. And so they've sat tight because they've got enough other change going on in their life. And so now that they've sat tight. However, what we're hearing about, and you might have heard about, is a phenomenon that we're seeing in the Northern Hemisphere and is predicted to hit Australia early in the new year, is the Great Resignation. And that is where we're expecting to see huge numbers of people change jobs. And that's as a result of people's psychological contract with work changing. So the way they view work and where it fits into their life now and how they view their employer and what they want from their life now, as far as development and flexibility and a whole lot of things has really changed. And people that sat tight and haven't made those changes will potentially make those changes at the end of this year, early in the new year. So that's something we're mindful of. And so what does all of that mean for us? A couple of things. One, we're thinking about how do we stop this mindset of owning talent and everyone needing to work for you on a full-time permanent basis, but how can you access talent, whether that be through freelance or contract or part-time or other flexible ways of employing talent, how can you think about bringing in consultants rather than needing to have someone as an employee? So that's something we're definitely expecting to see more of with the rise of the gig economy starting to take off as well. But the other thing I would say, both for attraction and retention, is the basics haven't changed. We still believe that people leave jobs because of the leader that they're working for, or that's who they leave to go and join. So leadership is still the number one thing that's really critical. And your ability to engage your people in one-on-one dialogues, understand their needs, understand what's motivating them, and continue to engage and communicate with them. All of those key basics around leadership are still critical. How do we also, as organisations, create positivity and possibility about the future and help us move through the phase that we've been in with so much fear and uncertainty through the pandemic? How do we start to come out the other side? And again, I see that as leadership, creating vision, hope, clarity for the future. And then finally, I guess this point here around re-recruit your existing staff. Imagine you were trying to attract them into your team now. How would you be engaging them, rewarding them, and so on? So make sure that we're not losing those basics, and don't just focus on the attraction of new into your schools, but also how do you retain your existing. Flexibility, we saw come up in the PeopleBench data. We are seeing that in every single data point, survey, industry around the world. And the research we're seeing is that flexibility is now the number one thing that people are looking for from their employer. And that is both either whether they stay where they currently are versus also changing and shifting to another employer. And we're seeing research that says people will pass up on pay rises and promotion in favour of flexibility, where it can support greater work-life integration. So how can you be supporting that flexibility for your workforce? Acknowledging that just like we have staff that are in branches that can't necessarily work from home, equally, how do you think through flexibility in every different aspect for your teachers? And also, how do you offer flexibility to your non-teaching staff as well? Wellbeing, again, we've seen that come up as a result of the busyness, tiredness, and so on. How do we continue to support the wellbeing and the resilience of our workforce? And again, that could be through different leave options, different support mechanisms, and giving people different skills and capability. Living and working with COVID is something we're working through, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, how we're going to look at opening back up and working quite differently with COVID in the communities. So that's an ongoing challenge. That's not just a health and safety challenge, but it's a change management one, and it's helping people learn different ways of working and leading teams. And then finally, which again probably picks up on the workforce strategy piece earlier, is how do we think about different ways of working and designing work going forward. And my top tip on this one, just like it is a journey for us here at NAB, is don't think that you've got to have all the answers just because you're the leader or you're the HR manager or what have you. My top tip would be to co-create and involve your people in the journey as much as you can. So don't think, oh, how are we going to offer flexibility to our teachers? We need them in the classroom all day long. That's one dimension of looking at flexibility. So how could you have a conversation with them to say what flexibility is important to you and how could we start to offer that and help you develop the solutions together? So that would be sort of my top tip around how else could we design work going forward and do things differently, and how can we co-create that journey with them. I could obviously talk about this for a long time, but we've got plenty to get through. So I'll just leave that slide and that question there for now as my top tips on that one. The second question I wanted to talk about was, what should schools be thinking about when preparing students for the workforce? And I think I've sort of grouped that into three key areas. One is, what are the skills for the future that we're seeing and that all the research are predicting will be the critical skills? And certainly, if I think about our own attraction and retention efforts at NAB, I'm already starting to see the shift towards these skills in the future. and that is creating those attraction and retention hotspots for us already. So I'll talk to that. The second thing is new ways of working and how I suspect work will look and feel for graduating students going forward. And then the third thing is, as obviously a large employer of both graduates and interns, into NAB, what are some of the things we look for that might be useful for your students to be aware of as well? And then we will open for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to skim through a couple of these slides, but I'm just going to headline a couple of points on each. And then in the post this afternoon, there will be links sent out. So if you did want to dive further into this research, which is publicly available research, those links will be sent out to you. So don't be afraid that I'm going to skim through. But this first slide is really, I guess, the point I wanted to touch on here. This is some research that Deloitte's have actually produced, looking at where is there an oversupply and a shortage of skills both now and predicted into the future. And they've grouped them around sort of three different areas: skills of the head, so where we're looking at cognitive skills, skills of the heart, so more the interpersonal creative skills, and skills of the hands, i.e. sort of your labouring type skills. And what they've worked out, and again, a lot of people think that the future is all about technology and jobs are going to be replaced by computers and bots, and, will we all have jobs? And what this research is actually showing is there will absolutely still be a need for human beings to be performing the large majority of our work going forward. And what's more likely to increase and be in short supply are those skills of the head and the skills of the heart. And that's the stuff, particularly the heart skills, are the ones that computers at this point in time will struggle to replace. So that's where I think there's opportunities for us to be thinking about students moving into and developing those skills that we know are still super critical going forward, whether it's the critical thinking skills, the empathy that's required in customer service roles, in leadership roles, even if you're in a technology role, the interpersonal aspects of being able to communicate with your stakeholders is super critical. So I think this sort of framing is really important for us to be aware of, and also to counterbalance that thought that technology will be taking over the world and taking over all of our jobs. The second slide that I've got here is, again, what is the forecast looking like over the next 4 years, or nearly 3 years now, I should say. And that is absolutely, without a doubt, digital and technology related jobs is where the growth is. So as far as sort of setting your students up for future employment opportunities, without a doubt, there is an undersupply in the Australian market as it relates to digital and technology roles in just about every area. So that is definitely sort of a sure bet as far as some of those roles there on the left. And then what we're seeing on the right, where there's a decreasing demand across most industries, are some of the traditional roles, things like accountants or accounting type positions, some of the labouring positions and some more administrative positions are some of the areas where we're seeing a decrease in demand. Again, not saying that those roles won't exist in future, but just that there's a shift away, and that's where we're starting to see some of that automation and AI start to impact some of those roles. So again, I think that's a useful framing up of where we see opportunities in future. This slide here, again, is just expanding a little bit more into what are even some jobs that don't even exist today that we are considering as the jobs likely of tomorrow. And this has been produced by the World Economic Forum. And again, this link will be sent out to you. But it's just talking about things like, jobs related to the cloud, to artificial intelligence, data science, different sorts of engineering positions and so on, that we expect to be seeing more of in future. But equally, what you'll see on the right is there are still needs for sales positions, HR roles and so on, that are also still very important positions that we see going forward. So we do still see roles in the care economy, in marketing, in sales, still being areas of growth, as well as the technology and digital roles. So that's just a very quick overview of some of the skills of the future to be thinking about and talking to the students about. A couple of final points, because I think I'm being wrapped for time. The ways of working that we expect to see more of in future. So we expect to see more of this, more of virtual remote communication skills, in addition to being able to communicate and build relationships face to face. So helping students be prepared for that world, which they obviously are in many instances right now. People being comfortable, therefore, if we are working remotely and not face to face with each other all the time, being able to self-manage and have that autonomy and that self-direction. To not have someone supervising you right there. Collaboration is absolutely critical. Digital and data literacy, whether you're working in those roles or not, everyone's going to be expected to be able to speak, to talk the talk. Creativity and innovation is one of those human attributes we see not going away and very hard to replace with technology. So that's where we really learn to specialise. Resilience, we've talked about, and I guess preparing ourselves mentally for, that job for life mindset is unlikely to continue going forward. And so how do we help grow lifelong learners with a growth mindset that can continue to develop throughout their careers? A couple of top tips of what we look for when we're recruiting what we call early talent. So work experience in any shape or form is fantastic. Ideally, customer experience is fantastic. Volunteering and anything extracurricular is well regarded. Proof of someone's learning agility and that lifelong learning mindset, and that they've continued to develop themselves and pursue that. And I guess those skills in problem solving, resilience, adaptability and change are going to continue to be critical going forward as the world of work continues to change. So I'm going to, I think, stop us there. That was my whirlwind journey, and I'm going to, I believe, pass back to Rachel for some Q&A.
Thank you, Carly. Again, another very insightful discussion, and some great concepts in there. Particularly took away about accessing talent, not owning talent, and re-recruiting our staff. As a people leader myself, even just thinking that through, what that would look like. So I think, great ways to think, and lots of similarities though. So we do have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So just a reminder to pop your questions into the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll pick those up at our end. But to kick that off, and I'm just looking at my screen here, sorry. One for PeopleBench, first up. What are the proactive school leaders currently doing to get ahead of their workforce supply challenges?
I'm happy to speak a little bit to that one. So I think over the last sort of 5, even 10 years, we've seen schools who've been preparing for this, knowing that narrative and the numbers have been pointing in the direction for quite some time, have been investing in, I would suggest, fairly obvious strategies around branding, around employer value propositions, certainly ideas we've seen across many sectors for a long time. I think if the question is, what are leaders who are really ahead of this curve doing now? They're moving beyond those sorts of initiatives and projects. They certainly still are features, but they're just one of the levers to pull in a broader workforce strategy. I think to some of the points highlighted in the research and in Carly, your discussion today, organisations are really being forced into the position of having to look at redesigning the way they're delivering their services, and therefore redesigning their workforces. So those people who, to my mind, are really out in front at the moment, getting their workforce strategy in place, within which things like your attraction branding campaigns are just one of the levers we're pulling, and they're building their capabilities and starting to introduce processes around redesigning schooling to be in a substantially different place. And some of the numbers are scary in this space, and the team and I have become more familiar with them, of course, over the last decade as we've been niching in this area. But in 2016, UNESCO was predicting a 69 million teacher shortfall for the K-12 sector globally. The US was predicting a 200,000 teacher shortfall by the end of 2024. And that was a pre-COVID stat. So when you layer on top of that things like the Great Resignation, you can appreciate that we really have quite an alarming state when it comes to global supply. And of course, there's a complex set of narratives around the attraction into the disciplines that are in schools. And an individual school needs a range of strategies to, in their specific context, be effective when it comes to this supply stuff. So yeah, I hope that addresses the question.
Thanks, Fleur, for that one. Another one, this one for you, Carly. What are the flexibility options NAB has implemented for those working in branches?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and it's something that's definitely not easy. So it's something we grapple with. We have a number of flexibility options in play across the organisation around employment types. So whether it be part-time, job sharing, type hours of work arrangements is certainly one that's been around for a long time. As we've got various different leave options for people to be able to take different types of lifestyle leave and flexible leave as needed. In recent times, as we've seen the role of branches change and the number of customers that actually go into branches change, we've actually been working with branch staff to help them also retrain into other areas. And so we find sometimes that people might be working on the counter in a branch for part of their day, and other parts of their day they're performing other roles. So they might be doing online chat or some phone-based stuff or other work. And so helping provide people different flexible career options as well, so that we're also giving people paths to keep learning and growing and progressing their career in different ways, and being able to undertake that development on the job is something that we're looking at. But we also acknowledge that through COVID, people have an even greater expectation around flexibility. So we've actually got a co-creation or co-design program underway currently. And so we've identified 10 different segments of our workforce that have different needs. So one, for example, is our regional parts of Australia that again are away from our capital cities, equally our branch staff and so on. And we've actually got some mini co-design sessions happening at the moment where we're asking them to tell us what flexibility means to them and helping us identify solutions that work given the nature of their jobs. So we've got that underway at present because we want to do more and we need to do more flexibility with them.
Great, thanks, Carly, for that. Probably got time for one more. Back to PeopleBench. Where should school leaders start to get better at supporting staff and wellbeing?
Mark, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, I might get us started and then feel free to jump in, Fleur. I think from our perspective, this is like the old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. So where we're working with schools around this stuff, the first step has been to get a handle on where they're currently at. So thinking about the different components that make up wellbeing and what that looks like in the school workforce context, measuring where schools at in terms of all of those different areas, where the strengths are, where the areas are that might need a bit of attention, and how that plays out differently for different groups of staff. So there are always going to be types of staff that are doing it tougher than others. So that is kind of step number one. Step number two is once you've got that data, acting on it in the same way that you would for any other strategic planning type of exercise. So if you think about the way that you put together a school improvement plan for a year, treat that the same with the way that you invest in boosting staff wellbeing. So over the course of this year, what are the things that we're going to do to target our gaps and boost our strengths and maintain our strengths, and treat it as a subset of that school improvement process, because it really is one of the most important drivers of improvement in a school from our perspective.
Great, thanks, Mike. Fleur, did you have anything to add?
No, and look, we're behavioural scientists, so we have a bias towards the you can't manage what you can't measure. But I think, to a point that came up earlier in the discussion as well, when we're in schools, we are in particular interested in how this impacts on our students and our communities. So making sure that the way we are trying to have an impact for our workforce is taken into consideration with the knock-on for students and those communities that we serve. the recipe for supporting staff wellbeing in one school is going to look different to the recipe in another. And so, Carly, to your point, the process of co-design with staff the whole way to the front line, all types of roles in a school, in a discussion about how do we make this a great place to work, and in particular, how do we make this a place where people can perform in a sustainable way, in a sustainable manner, i.e. I can have the impact that we're all looking for me to have with students and communities, and I can do that in a way that I can do it over a long horizon. Relationships in schools have such a phenomenally long tail. And so being able to position our workforce so that they can keep getting out of bed every morning and keep doing that really high emotional labour work is critically important. So yeah, I just echo some of the comments you've made, Mike. I'd flag that principle of code design and really encourage schools to make a deliberate space for this agenda for their workforce, aside from the work that they're doing with students.
Thanks.
I could just make one super quick, just build on that, which is just, again, not a one size fits all to any of this stuff. So what we know works for one person is different to the next. So one person values a wellbeing workshop and the other one would rather have the hour off to not have to think about anything. And so making sure you've got something that's across the spectrum that can support wellbeing in lots of different ways. So
yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. So that brings us to a close for our insight session today. So I want to thank everyone who joined us today and participating in the Q&As. We did have a few extra questions we didn't get to, so we will respond to those via email post this discussion. And also there'll be an email sent to everyone that's attended containing some additional resources that we spoke about today, also a link to a recording of this session, and also a feedback survey, which really helps us to ensure we continue to deliver really valuable events for our customers. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to the PeopleBench team. Thanks to Carly. And thank you, everyone else, for joining, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.